In August 1941, 3 lumbering Soviet bombers head towards Nazi-Allied territory. But these are no ordinary bombers, because for years the Soviets have been secretly developing a new kind of weapon: flying aircraft carriers, designed to pierce through enemy lines to deploy a swarm of fighter planes and dive bombers. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. And with the Soviet Union's darkest hour approaching, these massive juggernauts are about to make history, because they're headed straight for enemy territory. By the 1930s, it was clear that aircraft would play an essential role in future conflicts. But there was a problem that had plagued aircraft designers from the very beginning. Large, heavy bombers could carry lots of fuel, so they could fly great distances. But fighter aircraft, which had to be light and agile, could carry only enough fuel to cover a short distance. This mismatch had consequences. While bombers could fly deep into enemy territory, their fighter escorts couldn't. And over hostile airspace, the bombers were often on their own. With only a handful of machine guns to fend off enemy fighters, they were vulnerable and suffered heavy losses. But in 1930, Soviet engineer Vladamir Vakhmistrov came up with a radical solution.
Actually, it's pretty straightforward. If you could have the bombers carry the fighters, they could be transported over great distances and deployed whenever they were needed.
At first, Vakhmistrov's idea fell on deaf ears. The Red Army was focused on strength through numbers, not gambling on unproven ideas. But Vakhmistrov pressed on.
Comrades, flying aircraft carriers have tremendous potential. The fighters could not only protect the bombers, they could be fitted with their own bombs to make precise strikes against more challenging targets. Or they could be carried far out to sea to attack naval fleets which would otherwise be out of range. The fighters could even clear the paths for our bombers by destroying enemy anti-aircraft guns in advance or by blinding them with smoke screens, making accurate targeting impossible. Flying aircraft carriers could also patrol our borders, remaining airborne, ready to intercept enemy bombers before they made it anywhere near their targets.
The strategic benefits couldn't be ignored, not even by the Red Army. The platform for Vakhmistrov's aircraft carriers would be the mighty TB-1 and TB-3. As the largest bombers of their time, they had plenty of power to carry the fighters. But figuring out where to attach them was the tricky part. In the wrong spot, the fighters would interfere with the bombers' control, or airflow would make launching them impossible. And in an era before sophisticated wind tunnels, it would all have to be figured out through trial and error. Vakhmistrov would call his creation Zvano, and he would end up flight testing more than a dozen configurations. In some models, the fighters were mounted above the wings, in others suspended below. One arrangement even saw 5 fighters carried at once. Remarkably, instead of weighing the bomber down, the fighters actually helped to boost their performance, because during flight the fighters would run their engines continuously while drawing fuel from additional tanks fitted to the bomber. This brilliant setup allowed the bombers to fly faster, climb higher, and lift even more than they could have without the fighters attached. Launching the fighters was fairly straightforward. As long as the bomber was kept steady, any reasonably skilled pilot would manage. But reattaching to the carrier was another matter. On later versions, a trapeze-like system allowed pilots to dock with the carrier to take on more fuel. But docking was a skill that would take time to master. During flight, the fighters would communicate with the carrier using a telephone system, and a series of lights mounted in front of their gun sights would further signal commands.
Everyone was pleased with how Zveno flew, but on the ground, things were more challenging. To load the fighters over the wings, we'd need all the help we could get, calling over mechanics, ground controllers, and anyone else unfortunate enough to be at the airfield. We all wondered if we could ever get used to such a strenuous task. And then everything changed for the better when we were provided with a tractor. Of course, this happened only thanks to the Soviet Communist Party and the wisdom of our great leader, Comrade Joseph Stalin.
But the flying aircraft carrier concept was viable, and Vakhmistrov had laid the groundwork for something truly remarkable. Vakhmistrov envisioned building enormous airborne motherships capable of carrying more than 20 fighters. He also wanted to develop purpose-built fighters that wouldn't need heavy landing gear and could be built with smaller wings for greater speed and maneuverability. Of course, these ideas would have to wait until the Zveno carriers had proven useful to the Red Army. But after years of development, that turned out to be far more difficult than anticipated. Back in 1932, the Red Army seemed eager to accept the first version. But when new I-5 fighters became available, Vakhmistrov was ordered to modify his design. Then, when more powerful 4-engine TB3 bombers were introduced, Vakhmistrov was once again sent back to the drawing board. It was the same story when I-16 fighters became available. It wasn't until 1939, nearly a decade after the project started, that the Red Army finally accepted the carriers, with an order for 40 carriers equally divided amongst the Navy and Army. But by this point, some military planners were beginning to doubt the whole project. For one, the TB3 bomber was now obsolete. Next to a modern aircraft like the American B-17, the TB3 with its crude lines looked more like farm equipment, and there were doubts about whether the slow, lumbering bombers could still be effective in combat. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe was beginning to worry the Soviets. By 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe, and military planners feared that the Soviet Union was next. With war on the horizon, resources were shifted to the production of proven weapons. And it meant only 5 Zveno carriers were ever delivered, and even those were pulled from duty in the summer of 1940, dismantled and put into storage. It seemed like Vakhmistrov's efforts would amount to nothing. But the Soviet Union's darkest hour was approaching, and Zveno carriers were about to make history. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched a massive attack on the Soviet Union. Unprepared, Soviet defenses quickly crumbled. In the south, the Red Army scrambled to slow the advance towards the vital port cities of Odessa and Sevastopol by launching counterattacks on Nazi-allied Romania. A critical target for the Soviets was the King Carol I Bridge, as its destruction would cut a vital railway and oil pipeline and disrupt the flow of supplies to Romanian troops. For days, the Soviets tried to take out the bridge using conventional bombers. But each time, the bombers missed their targets and faced heavy resistance from anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. It was soon apparent that only precision dive bombers would have any chance of destroying the bridge. But the Soviet Union was critically short on capable dive bomber crews, and existing fighters lacked the range to reach the bridge. So the Red Army raced to pull the Zveno carriers from storage and bring them back to working order. Ordinarily, an I-16 fighter loaded up with nearly a third of its weight in bombs would have never made it off the runway. But the heavily loaded Zveno carriers had no trouble lifting off. Before striking the bridge, the Zveno pilots cut their teeth attacking an oil refinery. 40 kilometers from the target, 4 fighters detached from their carriers and headed towards the refinery. Patrolling fighters didn't even try to intercept the I-16s. After all, a Soviet fighter could never have made it so far behind enemy lines, so they were assumed to be friendly. The Zveno fighters made a devastating attack on the refinery. Amongst the confusion, the enemy couldn't even return fire. The first ever use of Zveno in combat was a huge success. In the early hours of August 10th, 3 Zveno carriers left to attack the King Carol Bridge. Although one carrier had to turn back due to mechanical problems, the remaining fighters pushed on. Taking on heavy anti-aircraft fire, they managed to strike the bridge. But while damaged, it remained standing. So 3 days later, the attack was repeated. This time, 6 fighters launched from the carriers. Again, they were met with fierce anti-aircraft fire, but the nimble I-16s managed to score 5 direct hits, completely destroying one of the bridge's spans, and they returned home without any losses. The Zveno carriers were proving to be far more useful than originally thought, capable of making sudden and unexpected attacks against difficult-to-reach targets. On August 17th, Zveno carriers destroyed a dry dock in Constanta. On the 28th, they destroyed crossings on the Dnieper River, helping to significantly slow the advance of Nazi troops. On September 9th, after yet another successful bombing raid, 2 I-16 fighters shot down a pair of Bf-109s. But after that, records stopped. The Soviet Union was only at the beginning of the most devastating war in history. Zveno carriers continued to fly under increasingly dire circumstances, and little is known about their ultimate fate, but there were at least 30 successful missions. While outdated by the time they saw action, the carriers proved to be highly effective, even if they were ultimately a desperate attempt to do what could have been done with modern capable dive bombers. And once dive bombers and well-trained crews became available in larger numbers, Zveno fell out of favor. But Vakhmistrov wasn't alone in his dream. The United States experimented with enormous aircraft-carrying airships, and later bombers to carry fighters over great distances. But the concept always seemed a little too ahead of its time. Until the 1960s, when emerging technologies promised to open up new possibilities. Major advances in aerodynamics, exotic new materials, and propulsion would soon pave the way for aircraft many times larger than anything in existence. And in 1969, Lockheed studied the concept in detail, examining the strategic advantages that a true airborne carrier could offer. The Lockheed CL-1201 is one of the most bizarre and fascinating aircraft studies ever produced, and you can learn more about it in my feature coming this month to Nebula. Nebula is where you'll find hours of exclusive Mustard videos that aren't available anywhere else. Videos that explore the fascinating stories behind iconic machines like the legendary F-117 Nighthawk, the MiG-31 Foxhound, and the M50 Bounder, and fantastic unrealized concepts like the insane Soviet proposal for ground effect aircraft carriers and a MiG-25 business jet. But you might be wondering, why are these videos only available on Nebula? On YouTube, the videos you see are influenced by algorithms, and creators are often restricted in the type of content they're able to make. Nebula is not like YouTube, and that changes how I make videos. On Nebula, I only need to make Mustard viewers happy, so I can make a video as long as it needs to be, delve into fascinating technical details, or experiment with entirely new formats. There's no algorithm, there's only you. And to prove it, my next feature on Nebula is going to be chosen entirely by you. Leave your suggestion in the pinned comment below, and the most requested topic becomes my next Nebula video. Nebula is owned directly by us, the creators, and that means your support goes directly into funding more high-quality projects that otherwise would never have been made. Sign up for Nebula using the link below, and you'll get access to tons of premium content for just $2.50 a month. But for a limited time, we're also offering lifetime memberships, a one-time payment that lets you access Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. Lifetime memberships are the best way to support Mustard and other creators. We're using the money they raise to fund the production of even bigger, more ambitious Nebula originals. Sign up for Nebula using the link in the description.